Every morning, the alarm rings, and the day begins not with choice but with obligation. Notifications flood the phone before the mind has fully awakened, each ping a subtle nudge toward someone else's priorities. Emails demand immediate attention, social media highlights invisible hierarchies, and news cycles insist on constant vigilance. Even moments meant for rest are consumed by the relentless hum of digital life, eroding mental space without warning. Workplaces operate like quiet pressure chambers. Titles, metrics, and endless small decisions create invisible levers of control. People comply not because they are coerced, but because complexity has subtly trained them to surrender autonomy. The systems around us reward conformity and punish deviation with isolation, judgment, or stagnation. Even friendships and family roles are shaped by unspoken rules, encouraging behavior that aligns with expectation rather than intention. Material abundance, ironically, becomes another layer of invisible chains. Every possession, subscription, or routine ties attention and energy to obligations that are not truly one's own. The more complex life becomes, the harder it is to act freely, to pause, or to consider a path less traveled. In this intricate web, quiet dissatisfaction grows, almost imperceptibly, alongside a subtle curiosity: if the world's complexity keeps us compliant, what might simplicity unlock? Every additional layer of responsibility, every new possession, every commitment quietly narrows the space in which one can act freely. A car loan, a mortgage, or even the expectation to maintain appearances shifts power away from the individual and toward forces beyond their control. Emotional dependencies operate similarly: approval, recognition, and the fear of judgment tether decisions to the reactions of others. What once seemed like choice slowly becomes a chain of obligations, invisible yet unyielding. Psychologically, complexity fragments attention and dilutes focus. The more a person tries to manage, the more susceptible they become to subtle manipulation: advertisements, peer pressure, office politics, even social media algorithms that anticipate desires before they are fully formed. Every decision is filtered through existing commitments, every impulse measured against perceived consequences. In this system, vulnerability is built not from external threats alone, but from the intricate web of self-imposed dependencies. By contrast, the fewer attachments and obligations a person maintains, the less influence the outside world has over their actions. Complexity, in all its forms, breeds control, while simplicity preserves freedom. As the mind quietly observes these patterns, a subtle realization emerges: most of what constrains daily life is not necessity, but layers of chosen entanglement, habits, possessions, and social scripts that one can, with awareness, begin to loosen. Amid the tangle of obligations and digital noise, there exists a quieter path, one that is rarely discussed, rarely practiced, and often dismissed as impractical. It is not a strategy promoted in magazines or social media feeds, nor is it measured by metrics or market trends. Instead, it is a deliberate paring down of life, a careful shedding of excess that reveals the space for true autonomy. Simplicity, in this sense, is not poverty or deprivation, it is clarity. It is the ability to act without invisible strings, to make decisions rooted in intention rather than obligation. By reducing dependencies, material, social, and psychological, a person becomes less predictable, less influenced, and, in subtle ways, more powerful. There is an almost paradoxical strength in having less: fewer distractions, fewer attachments, fewer points of leverage for others to manipulate. Throughout history, a few rare individuals embraced this quietly radical lifestyle, living on the edges of society, deliberately unconcerned with wealth, reputation, or the expectations of others. Their lives were designed for autonomy, for freedom that comes not from accumulation, but from deliberate detachment. For the modern mind, weighed down by complexity, this alternative appears almost forbidden, yet it carries a magnetic curiosity. What would it feel like to exist unshackled, untethered by the intricate dependencies that dominate daily life? Diogenes was a figure who challenged the very foundations of his society, not with speeches or political campaigns, but through the way he chose to live. In a world obsessed with wealth, status, and appearances, he deliberately embraced a life stripped to its essentials. He carried only the simplest possessions, often just a cloak and a small cup, discarding anything deemed unnecessary. His home was not a house or a palace, but a large ceramic jar, offering shelter without excess. He rejected the trappings of social hierarchy, refusing honors, titles, or recognition, and often confronted the wealthy and powerful with quiet, pointed questions about their priorities. Diogenes' actions were direct yet unobtrusive. He did not seek attention for spectacle, but his way of living naturally provoked reflection in those around him. His daily choices embodied a philosophy: freedom emerges not through accumulation or achievement, but through deliberate detachment from dependency. Though centuries have passed, the lessons of his life remain striking. He demonstrated that autonomy is attainable through intentional simplicity, and that the conventions of society often constrain more than they protect. For anyone willing to observe, his lifestyle reveals a subtle yet profound power, the kind that comes not from controlling others, but from mastering one's own needs and resisting the pressures that bind most people to invisible chains. True freedom is rarely found in the accumulation of wealth, recognition, or comfort. Rather, it resides in the ability to act without invisible strings guiding every decision. Detachment, the conscious release from materialism, social validation, and habitual expectations, creates this space. When a person is no longer tethered to possessions, opinions, or routines imposed by others, they begin to see life as a series of choices, not obligations. Material objects, while convenient, often dictate priorities. A new car, an expensive home, or the latest technology may seem like status or security, but they silently demand attention, resources, and maintenance. Social approval works in the same way. The need to be liked or admired shapes behavior, often unconsciously, leading to compromise and self-censorship. Even daily routines, seemingly harmless, can become chains when they leave little room for reflection or spontaneity. By stepping back from these entanglements, autonomy emerges naturally. Decisions are guided by intention rather than expectation. Every choice becomes a measure of personal power, not compliance. For viewers, the appeal lies not in asceticism, but in imagining life unburdened by external pressures, freedom to act, think, and exist on one's own terms. Detachment, in essence, transforms simplicity into a quietly radical form of control, one that reshapes both mind and action. Living simply often appears, at first glance, to be an act of vulnerability. Society measures strength in accumulation, wealth, possessions, influence, and status, and those who reject these markers can seem exposed or powerless. The minimalist, the detached thinker, or the one who chooses less over more may be quietly judged as weak, naive, or unambitious. Yet this perception masks a deeper, almost paradoxical truth: vulnerability in the conventional sense can coexist with a form of freedom that is fundamentally unconquerable. When a person is untethered from the chains of expectation, dependency, and external validation, they become unpredictable. Their actions cannot be bought, coerced, or easily manipulated. Challenges that would overwhelm the burdened mind, financial crises, social pressure, or public scrutiny, affect them far less, because their equilibrium is internal, not dependent on circumstance. What looks like fragility is, in reality, resilience. This is the hidden strength of simplicity. it converts perceived weakness into strategic autonomy. The fewer obligations, attachments, and dependencies one carries, the less influence anyone else has over them. For viewers, the revelation is subtle but profound. By embracing a life stripped to essentials, a person gains a quiet power that society cannot measure, control, or diminish, quietly defying conventional rules while remaining fully alive. Desire is often seen as a driving force, pushing people toward achievement, status, or comfort. Yet every want, every expectation, quietly consumes mental energy, shaping attention and dictating behavior. The pursuit of more money, more recognition, more possessions creates invisible obligations, each one demanding thought, worry, and effort. Over time, this accumulation of desire fragments focus, leaving little space for reflection or intentional action. By consciously observing the nature of one's wants, a person can begin to see how many are externally imposed products of advertising, social comparison, or habitual patterns rather than genuine need. Recognizing this is the first step toward liberation. The mind starts to differentiate between fleeting impulses and meaningful pursuits, and with that clarity comes subtle empowerment, the realization that not all wants must be acted upon, and that freedom grows in the spaces between them. This reduction of desire does not require deprivation or radical renunciation. It is an internal realignment, a mental pruning that shifts attention from the endless chase to what truly matters. Viewers may notice that they have already begun this process in small ways, through habits, choices, or moments of quiet reflection. By minimizing distractions, the mind becomes sharper, energy is reclaimed, and autonomy emerges not as an abstract concept but as a tangible, lived experience. Society measures success in ways that are often arbitrary, yet deeply persuasive: the size of a paycheck, the prestige of a job title, the approval of peers and strangers alike. From early education to workplace culture, individuals are conditioned to internalize these definitions, shaping desires and dictating behavior. The pursuit of such external validation can feel necessary, even inevitable, yet it subtly erodes autonomy, chaining attention and energy to outcomes dictated by others. Simplicity disrupts this pattern. By deliberately questioning the assumptions society imposes, a person begins to see that many requirements are optional, constructed more for social conformity than personal fulfillment. Choosing less, fewer possessions, fewer obligations, fewer approvals to chase breaks the hold of these invisible metrics. What was once perceived as weakness or rebellion becomes, in practice, a form of strategic freedom. The power lies not in outright defiance, but in quiet observation and selective disengagement. By ignoring norms, attention is redirected toward what is genuinely meaningful, creating mental space previously occupied by comparison and judgment. For viewers, this realization sparks a subtle curiosity: if a life less tethered to societal expectation is possible, what other layers of influence might they gently dissolve? The mind begins to imagine autonomy not as a distant ideal, but as a tangible, attainable practice. Living with essentials means considering each aspect of life through the lens of necessity rather than habit. Possessions, schedules, and commitments are no longer accumulated by default, they are chosen intentionally. A wardrobe consists only of what is useful, a calendar is uncluttered, and obligations are undertaken because they align with purpose, not obligation. This approach transforms daily life into a mental and physical ecosystem, where each element serves clarity and autonomy rather than distraction or external validation. The beauty of this lifestyle is its subtlety. It does not demand dramatic sacrifices or radical rejection of society, but rather a conscious alignment with what is truly valuable. Energy once spent on maintaining appearances, chasing status, or managing superfluous belongings is reclaimed for thought, reflection, and deliberate action. The mind becomes lighter, more focused, and increasingly resistant to the pressure of outside influences. For viewers, this presents a model that is both practical and imaginative. Life can be tested in small ways, eliminating a recurring obligation, simplifying a routine, or questioning a purchase before making it. Each adjustment becomes an experiment in autonomy, gradually revealing the liberating power of simplicity. Over time, what starts as mindful reduction blossoms into a stable foundation of clarity, calm, and quiet confidence, making freedom not just a concept, but a lived experience. When life is filled with unnecessary possessions, obligations, and distractions, the mind becomes a crowded space. Attention is divided, decisions are delayed, and even simple tasks feel draining. Every notification, every commitment, every mental to-do chips away at clarity, leaving the individual perpetually reactive rather than deliberate. The more cluttered the environment, physical or digital, the more the mind mirrors it. Struggling to prioritize, focus, or act with confidence. Simplicity, by contrast, creates mental breathing room. Reducing external noise allows thoughts to emerge clearly and decisions to be made without the constant interference of competing demands. When fewer possessions need attention, fewer social cues demand compliance, and fewer routines dictate behavior, the mind can operate with precision. Patterns become visible, priorities are easily recognized, and choices align more directly with intention rather than habit. For viewers, this effect is both tangible and immediate. Reflecting on personal mental clutter, overfull inboxes, endless tasks, or routine obligations reveals the hidden cost of complexity. By imagining what could be removed or simplified, a sense of quiet satisfaction emerges. The mind recognizes the potential for sharper focus, stronger decision-making, and a calm attentiveness that had been dulled by the constant noise of modern life. Much of modern stress is invisible, carried in the mind rather than the body. Approval, comparison, and judgment silently shape behavior, dictating choices and constraining thought. People often seek validation without realizing how much of their emotional energy is spent chasing it: likes, compliments, recognition, even subtle nods of agreement. Envy and social comparison follow naturally, creating a quiet tension that never fully dissipates. Simplicity fosters emotional independence by reducing these pressures. When attachment to validation, status, or opinion is loosened, the mind experiences a subtle liberation. Decisions are guided by personal judgment rather than by the anticipated reactions of others. Emotional responses are self-contained, not triggered by external expectation, and the need to compete or impress diminishes. In this state, the individual is less reactive, more deliberate, and increasingly resilient to social manipulation or peer pressure. For viewers, the appeal is twofold: there is both comfort and power in self-reliance. Freedom from emotional dependency allows a person to act intentionally, think clearly, and measure success by personal standards rather than society's. It also provokes reflection: how much of your daily life is shaped by others' opinions, and how might quiet detachment shift your experience? Emotional autonomy, like clarity of mind, becomes a subtle yet profound form of control. The true power of simplicity lies not in comfort or clarity alone, but in the way it positions a person outside the usual levers of control. When life is stripped of unnecessary dependencies, material, social, or emotional external influence loses its grip. Manipulation, subtle or overt, becomes far less effective because there are fewer predictable patterns for others to exploit. Those who rely on status, wealth, or social pressure find that their usual tactics fall flat against someone who operates on self-determined terms. In practical terms, the individual who has simplified life is quieter but no less powerful. Decisions are made based on intention rather than expectation, priorities are chosen rather than assigned, and actions flow from autonomy rather than compliance. Office politics, peer pressure, or hierarchical control no longer dictate behavior, because the mind and schedule are free from unnecessary entanglements. For viewers, this realization creates a subtle yet profound sense of victory. Mental autonomy is not abstract, it is actionable, measurable in the way choices are made and energies allocated. By embracing simplicity, one becomes strategically uncontrollable, free not only from distraction or stress, but from the influence of those who seek to direct, manipulate, or constrain. Power emerges quietly, naturally, and sustainably, without confrontation or effort. Change does not always arrive in dramatic gestures. Often, the most profound shifts begin with small, deliberate choices, moments of quiet observation where one considers what truly matters. A single decision to let go of an unnecessary obligation, to simplify a routine, or to reduce mental clutter can ripple outward, subtly transforming the way life is experienced. Each small act of simplification is less about deprivation and more about reclaiming space for clarity, reflection, and autonomy. These adjustments invite thought rather than instruction. One might notice how much attention is spent maintaining appearances, responding to notifications, or fulfilling obligations that feel more habitual than intentional. By experimenting mentally with the idea of letting go, imagining a day without certain distractions, or a week without a particular attachment, the mind begins to sense the benefits of simplicity. For the curious viewer, the appeal lies in the quiet power of these experiments. They are reversible, personal, and reflective, allowing the individual to measure the effects on thought, emotion, and focus. Over time, small choices accumulate, creating a life that is lighter, freer, and more intentional. The subtle victories of simplicity, less noise, more attention, a calmer mind, demonstrate that freedom is not an abstract ideal, but a practice that begins with a single, conscious step. Simplicity is as much a mental exercise as a lifestyle. One of its most powerful tools is reflection, examining attachments, dependencies, and impulses with quiet attention. By observing the subtle forces that shape choices, the mind begins to recognize where freedom has been seated. A habit that feels harmless, a purchase, a social obligation, a recurring thought, may reveal itself as a small tether, quietly directing attention and energy. Engaging in these mental experiments does not require action, only awareness. Viewers can ask themselves questions: which routines consume more energy than they return? Which possessions dictate behavior or thought? Which desires arise from others' expectations rather than personal need? This internal dialogue cultivates insight, revealing patterns that often go unnoticed until consciously observed. For the introspective thinker, the process itself is liberating. Each observation is a subtle victory, the recognition that control over one's life is partially internal, partially chosen. By repeatedly engaging the mind in this way, curiosity deepens, and a sense of empowerment grows. These mental experiments become a quiet practice, a rehearsal for autonomy, showing that detachment is not an abstract ideal but a lived, iterative process. Over time, participants feel increasingly capable of directing life from intention rather than inertia. Living simply is not a single act but a cycle, a feedback loop where autonomy fuels calm, calm reinforces clarity, and clarity strengthens decision-making. Each small step toward reducing unnecessary attachments or obligations makes subsequent choices easier, creating a compounding effect. As the mind experiences less interference from external pressures, it begins to notice patterns, recognize priorities, and act with intention rather than reaction. This self-reinforcing loop mirrors the lives of those rare individuals who embraced simplicity long before modern philosophy codified it. Like them, anyone willing to experiment with less discovers that autonomy is not fragile, it grows stronger with practice. The quieter the life, the more subtle influences fade, and the more space there is to cultivate resilience, focus, and a sense of strategic power. What once seemed vulnerable becomes protected by the very structure of simplicity itself. For the viewer, this realization is both contemplative and energizing. It is proof that alternative ways of living are possible, that the rules society prizes are not absolute, and that freedom is not theoretical, it is a lived, iterative experience. By consciously engaging with simplicity, one enters a loop where mental clarity, emotional independence, and quiet power reinforce each other, turning reflection into action and autonomy into a deeply satisfying way of life.